The moving truck pulled away from the curb as Andrew wiped sweat from his forehead. After 5 years of overtime and saving every penny, he finally had the keys to his own place in Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood had perfectly trimmed grass, big trees, and houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. It had been a long road to get here. At 35, Andrew had climbed from entry-level coding jobs to becoming a senior software engineer. Every promotion meant he was one step closer to his dream. His parents had always rented, moving from apartment to apartment when rent went up. "And something nobody can take away," his father used to say. Today, that dream had finally come true. The colonial-style house wasn't the biggest on the block, but with its red brick front and black shutters, it had character. The previous owners had let some things go. The kitchen was straight out of the 90s, and the backyard was more weeds than grass. But Andrew saw potential in every room. "Man, I still can't believe this is yours," said his cousin Tyrell, carrying a heavy box through the front door. "Remember that studio apartment you had when you first moved to the city?" Andrew laughed. "With the leaky ceiling and that neighbor who played drums at midnight. Yeah, I've come a long way." In those first weeks, Andrew's life became a blur of paint cans, wood planks, and takeout containers. He would wake up at 5, go to his tech job downtown, then come home and work on the house until midnight. On weekends, his contractor buddy Ray would bring his truck loaded with tools, and they'd tackle the bigger projects together. One Saturday, while they were tearing out the old kitchen cabinets, Ray mentioned something that made Andrew pause. "Just so you know, these fancy neighborhoods can be funny about things. My cousin bought in Meadowbrook last year, and their HOA is always on his case about something." "HOA?" Andrew asked, pulling out a nail with a crowbar. "Homeowners Association. They make rules about what your house can look like, when you can put out trash, all that stuff. Just keep an eye on your mailbox for their welcome packet." Andrew shrugged it off. He'd read something about an HOA in his closing papers, but hadn't given it much thought. He was playing by the rules, getting permits for the renovation work, and keeping construction debris in a rented dumpster that sat neatly in his driveway. The welcome packet never came, but Andrew was too busy to notice. Between work and renovations, he barely had time to meet the neighbors. An older lady next door named Eleanor had brought over homemade cookies and seemed friendly enough. A couple across the street with young kids had waved from their yard. Everyone else was just faces in car windows, driving past as Andrew worked on his front garden. 3 weeks after moving in, Andrew decided to plant some bushes along the front walkway. The spring sun felt good on his back as he dug holes for the new plants. He had his earbuds in, bobbing his head to his favorite playlist while patting soil around a small azalea bush. He didn't notice the shadow falling across his yard until it reached his hands. Looking up, he saw a woman standing on the edge of his property. She was maybe in her 50s, with blonde hair cut in a sharp bob and sunglasses perched on her head. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, and she clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Andrew pulled out his earbuds and stood up, brushing dirt from his hands onto his jeans. "Hi there," he said with a smile. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't return his smile. Instead, she looked past him toward the house, as if expecting someone else to appear. "I need to speak with the homeowner," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "There have been several complaints about this property." Andrew's smile faded a bit, but he kept it in place. "Well, that would be me. I'm the owner. Just moved in a few weeks ago." The look of disbelief that flashed across the woman's face was quick, but not quick enough to miss. "You?" she asked, looking him up and down, taking in his dirty t-shirt and work gloves. "You're the owner of this house." And just like that, Andrew knew exactly what kind of neighbor she was going to be. Andrew stood up straight, wiping the dirt from his hands onto his jeans. The woman's eyes narrowed as she looked him over again. "I'm Patricia Whitfield," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She emphasized the word president like it made her the queen of the neighborhood. "Nice to meet you," Andrew said, though it wasn't feeling very nice at all. "I'm Andrew Thomas. Like I said, I just bought this place last month." Patricia's lips pinched tighter. "Well, Mr. Thomas, if that's the case, then you should know that we've received several complaints about this property." "Complaints? What kind of complaints?" Andrew asked, genuinely confused. He'd been careful to keep the renovation mess contained and hadn't made much noise. Patricia flipped through papers on her clipboard with sharp, angry movements. Construction vehicles parked on the street, a dumpster in the driveway for weeks, people coming and going at all hours. This isn't a construction zone, Mr. Thomas. It's a respectable neighborhood. Amber took a deep breath. I have all the proper permits for the work I'm doing. The dumpster is properly rented and placed completely on my property, not blocking anyone. And those people are my friends helping me fix up my home. Patricia wasn't listening. She was taking pictures of Andrew's front yard with her phone, zooming in on the newly planted bushes. These azaleas, she said, pointing with a manicured finger. They aren't on the approved vegetation list. Excuse me. Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing. All exterior landscaping must be approved by the HOA Architectural Committee before installation, Patricia recited, as if reading from a script she'd memorized. It's in the covenant you signed when you purchased the property. Andrew frowned. I never received any information about approved plants. No one sent me a welcome packet or the rules. Ignorance of the rules doesn't excuse breaking them, Patricia said sharply. I'll need to see proof that you're the actual homeowner. We've had issues with unauthorized occupancy in the past. The implication hung in the air between them. Andrew felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice steady. Ma'am, I have my deed inside if you really need to see it. But I don't think you're asking my neighbors for proof they own their homes. Patricia's cheeks flushed pink. Don't make this about something it's not. I'm simply doing my job enforcing the rules everyone agreed to follow. Just then, Eleanor from next door came out to get her mail. She saw Andrew and Patricia and waved cheerfully. Hello there. Beautiful day for gardening, isn't it? She called, walking over to join them. She was in her 70s with silver hair and a warm smile. I see you've met our new neighbor Patricia. Patricia's posture stiffened even more, if that was possible. You know this, gentlemen. Of course. Andrew bought the Wilson place. Such a nice young man, and so hardworking. Those azaleas look lovely, dear, Eleanor said, smiling at the plants. I have some in the same shade in my backyard. These plants aren't approved by the committee, Patricia said through gritted teeth. Eleanor laughed, a bright sound in the tense air. Oh, don't be silly. Half the neighborhood has azaleas. The Henderson family has an entire row of them. Andrew could see Patricia struggling with Eleanor's friendly defense. The rules apply to everyone, Eleanor, she said finally. And there are other issues here as well. She turned back to Andrew, handing him a paper from her clipboard. This is a notice of violation. You have 48 hours to remove the unauthorized plants and move the dumpster off the property. The fine is $100 per day until the violations are corrected. Andrew took the paper, his fingers crumpling the edge slightly. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we could talk about this reasonably. The rules are clear, Patricia cut him off. And if you're renting this property, I'll need to speak with the actual owner immediately. Elena gasped softly. Andrew just stared at Patricia for a long moment. I am the owner, he said quietly. And I think you know that. Patricia turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply on the sidewalk. 48 hours, Mr. Thomas, and if there are any more complaints, there will be additional fines. As she walked away, Eleanor patted Andrew's arm. Don't you worry about her, she whispered. She pulls this with anyone she doesn't think belongs here. But trust me, you belong here more than she does. Andrew looked down at the violation notice, then at his half-planted garden. Something told him this was just the beginning. The rain tapped against Andrew's kitchen window as he sat at his counter, sorting through a growing pile of papers. 2 weeks had passed since his run-in with Patricia, and things had only gotten worse. He now had 7 violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. This is getting out of hand, he muttered, picking up the latest notice that had been taped to his door that morning. Apparently, his garbage can had been left at the curb for excessive time after trash collection. Andrew had pulled it back before dinner, but the notice claimed it was still out at 8 p.m. He knew that wasn't true because he'd been home all evening. His phone buzzed with a text from his cousin. How's life in Fancy Town? Andrew typed back. Remember when I said buying this house was a dream come true? Now it's more like a nightmare with an HOA. The week after their first meeting, Patricia had driven by Andrew's house at least once a day, sometimes stopping to take photos. When he kept his azaleas, refusing to dig up perfectly good plants, she'd issued another fine. When his buddy Ray parked his truck in the driveway for a weekend project, she'd left a notice about commercial vehicles not being allowed in residential areas. Andrew had tried to fight back by reading the actual HOA rules, carefully documenting everything with time-stamped photos, and sending polite but firm emails to the entire HOA board explaining the situation. So far, he'd heard nothing back except more notices from Patricia. He sipped his coffee and looked around his half-finished kitchen. The cabinets were installed, but the countertops were temporary, and appliances stood in the middle of the room waiting for the final hookups. He'd had to slow down the renovations to deal with this mess. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Eleanor standing there with a covered dish. "I brought you some lasagna," she said. "Figured you might be too busy fighting the dragon lady to cook." Andrew laughed for the first time in days. "You're a lifesaver, Eleanor. Come in." As they sat in the kitchen, Eleanor told him she'd seen Patricia measuring the height of his grass with a ruler that morning. "The woman has lost her mind," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "But you're not the first, you know. Last year, the Rodriguez family 2 streets over got the same treatment. They had a little boy with autism who had a special swing in their backyard. Patricia claimed it violated some rule about permanent structures and made them take it down." "What happened to them?" Andrew asked. Eleanor looked down at her hands. "They moved. Couldn't take the stress anymore." "But honey, I don't want that to happen to you." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going anywhere. I worked too hard for this house." Later that evening, as Andrew was finishing some work emails, he heard a car door slam outside. Looking through the window, he saw Patricia standing in front of his house with another woman, pointing at his porch light and making notes. His doorbell rang shortly after. When he answered, Patricia thrust a paper at him without even a greeting. "This is an official notice to cease business operations at this residential property," she said coldly. "We have evidence that you're running a commercial enterprise from this address, which violates zoning regulations." Andrew stared at the paper in disbelief. "What business? I'm a software engineer. I work downtown. We've observed consistent traffic coming and going, work vehicles, equipment deliveries. This isn't a warehouse, Mr. Thomas. Those are my friends helping with renovations." Andrew's patience was finally wearing thin. "And my name is on the deed. I have every right to improve my own property." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "You have 30 days to comply or face eviction proceedings." Andrew felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "You can't evict me. I own this house." "The HOA has the authority to enforce compliance through legal channels," Patricia said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Perhaps you should have read the fine print before moving into a neighborhood with standards." As she walked away, Andrew looked down at the notice. The word Evict seemed to pulse on the page. This was no longer about fines or petty rule enforcement. She was actually trying to force him out of his own home. That night, Andrew couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, wondering how things had gone so wrong so quickly. Then a thought occurred to him. If Patricia was doing this to him, she'd probably done it to others too. And bullies like her only succeeded when people fought alone. It was time to start talking to the neighbors. Andrew sat on Eleanor's floral couch, balancing a cup of tea on his knee. The living room was filled with neighbors he'd never met before. There was Mr. Chen from down the street, the Diaz family from around the corner, Mrs. Washington from across the park, and a few others. They'd all come because Eleanor had made some calls, saying only that it was about Patricia. "I can't believe she's trying to evict you," Mrs. Washington said, shaking her head. She was in her 60s with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun. "Though I can't say I'm surprised. That woman has been a thorn in everyone's side for years." Mr. Chen nodded. "She cited us for hanging Chinese New Year decorations last January. Called them gaudy and inappropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. My family has celebrated that way for generations." One by one, the neighbors shared their stories. The Diaz family had been fined for having too many cars when their relatives visited for their daughter's quinceañera. Mrs. Washington had received warnings about her garden gnomes being unauthorized lawn ornaments. Everyone had a Patricia story, but no one had challenged her until now. The problem is she's got 3 friends on the HOA board, Eleanor explained. They rubber stamp whatever she wants. The rest of the board members don't pay much attention because they're busy with their own lives. Andrew listened carefully, taking notes on his phone. So she's targeting people, but making it look official through the HOA. That's discrimination, plain and simple. We all know it, Mr. Dyers said, but proving it is another thing. She's careful to always cite some rule or regulation, even if she ignores the same issue when it's someone she approves of. Andrew thought about this for a moment. What we need is evidence that she's enforcing rules differently depending on who you are. Like how the Thompson family has had a basketball hoop in their driveway for years with no problems, but when the Johnsons put one up, they got a violation notice the next day. Mrs. Washington suggested. Exactly, Andrew said, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. If we can document these differences, we might have something. He pulled out his laptop and created a shared online folder where everyone could upload photos, dates, and details of their experiences with Patricia and the HOA. I work with data every day, Andrew explained. What looks like isolated incidents might show a clear pattern when we put it all together. By the end of the evening, the neighbors had a plan. They would document everything. Which houses got cited for violations and which didn't, what kinds of enforcement actions were taken, and how quickly the issues were addressed or ignored, depending on who lived there. Mr. Chen, who worked as a photographer, offered to take pictures of similar violations throughout the neighborhood to show the selective enforcement. Elena would dig through her files for past HOA newsletters and meeting minutes that might show a pattern. As everyone was leaving, Mrs. Washington pulled Andrew aside. You know, we've never had someone stand up to her like this before. Most people just try to fly under the radar or eventually move away. I'm not moving, Andrew said firmly. This is my home now. Back at his house, Andrew couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with everything he'd learned. He went to his home office and started a spreadsheet mapping out which houses in the neighborhood had received violations and which hadn't. He added notes about who lived in each home based on what he'd learned from his new allies. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Chen. Started photographing the neighborhood today. Look at these 2 houses with similar gardens. Only one got a violation notice. Guess which one? The message included 2 photos of nearly identical front yards with flowering bushes. The only difference was who owned them. Andrew added the information to his spreadsheet. A pattern was already emerging. Another message came in, this time from Mrs. Diaz. Found this in my files. HOA approval for the Wilsons to build a shed last year. Almost identical to the one the Gonzalez family was denied permission for 3 months earlier. As the evidence piled up, Andrew felt both angry and determined. Patricia had been getting away with this behavior for years, making people feel unwelcome in their own homes. But not anymore. With his background in data analysis and this new community of allies, Andrew was going to build a case that not even Patricia could dismiss. The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. They would be ready. Andrew straightened his tie as he parked his car outside the community center. The HOA meeting was scheduled to start in 15 minutes, but he'd arrived early on purpose. He grabbed his laptop bag and a thick folder of printed documents. His phone buzzed with encouraging texts from his new neighbors. We're right behind you, Eleanor had written. Literally, we're parking now. The community center was a small brick building with a meeting room that could hold about 50 people. Usually, according to Eleanor, HOA meetings drew maybe 10 residents at most. Tonight would be different. When Andrew walked in, Patricia was already there, arranging papers at the front table with 4 other board members. She glanced up when the door opened, her eyes narrowing when she saw him. Mr. Thomas, she said coolly. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us this evening. I checked the bylaws, Andrew replied calmly. All homeowners are welcome at board meetings. Patricia's smile was tight. Of course, though the agenda is already quite full. Before Andrew could respond, the doors opened again and people began streaming in. First Eleanor and Mrs. Washington, then the Chen family, the Diazes, and at least a dozen other neighbors Andrew had met over the past 2 weeks. Patricia's face registered shock, quickly hidden behind a mask of professionalism. "What's going on?" one of the other board members whispered to Patricia. He was an older man with glasses and a confused expression. "I have no idea, Richard," Patricia hissed back. As more neighbors arrived, extra chairs had to be brought in. The small room was soon packed, with people standing against the walls. Andra made sure to sit in the front row, directly in Patricia's line of sight. Richard, who turned out to be the board vice president, called the meeting to order. They went through routine business first, approving previous minutes, discussing the community pool maintenance, voting on a new landscaping contract for common areas. Andra waited patiently. Finally, Richard said, "That concludes our planned agenda. Before we adjourn, does anyone have items for open discussion?" Andra raised his hand immediately. Patricia tried to ignore him, but Richard pointed in his direction. "Yes, the gentleman in the front." Andra stood up, laptop in hand. "Thank you. My name is Andra Thomas. I moved into 457 Oak Ridge Avenue 2 months ago." He paused, making eye contact with each board member. "I'm here tonight because I've been targeted with harassment, discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules, and most recently, a completely baseless eviction threat." A murmur ran through the room. Richard looked confused. "Eviction? The HOA doesn't have authority to evict homeowners." Andrew pulled out the notice Patricia had given him. "This document suggests otherwise. It was delivered to me personally by Ms. Whitfield." Richard took the paper, adjusting his glasses to read it. "This isn't official HOA letterhead. When was this board decision made?" "I don't recall voting on any eviction proceedings." Patricia's face flushed red. "It was a standard violation notice for unauthorized business operations. The property is zoned residential only." "I don't run a business from my home," Andra said firmly. "I'm a software engineer at TechWorks downtown. The traffic Ms. Whitfield observed was friends helping me with renovations." Andra connected his laptop to the projector. The screen lit up with a spreadsheet showing houses, dates, and violation types in neat columns. "What I've discovered, with help from my neighbors, is a clear pattern of selective enforcement of HOA rules." He clicked through a series of side-by-side photos, identical infractions that had been treated differently depending on who lived in the house. Basketball hoops that were fine at one house but violations at another. Holiday decorations that were acceptable for some families but not others. Over the past 2 weeks, I've documented 43 instances where the same rule violation was ignored at some homes but resulted in notices or fines at others. Andrew's voice remained steady. "The only difference appears to be who lives in those homes." The room had gone completely silent. Andrew clicked to a new slide showing a map of the neighborhood with houses color-coded by how many violations they'd received. The data shows that homes owned by people of color receive 3 times more violation notices than those owned by white residents. Homes owned by immigrants receive twice as many. Elena stood up. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I've watched this pattern develop over the past 5, ever since Patricia became president." One by one, neighbors began sharing their experiences. Patricia's face grew paler with each story. Richard cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitfield, do you have a response to these allegations?" All eyes turned to Patricia. Her usual confident posture had collapsed, and for a moment she looked small behind the table. Then she straightened her shoulders and forced a laugh. "This is absurd," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Mr. Thomas is clearly upset about receiving violation notices and has blown this into something it's not. These so-called patterns are nothing more than coincidences." Andra stayed calm. "Coincidences that happen 3 times more often to certain homeowners? The math doesn't support that conclusion." Patricia's eyes darted around the room, looking for allies, but found only stern faces. "These rules exist to protect our property values. I've simply been enforcing them as written." Selectively, Mr. Chen added from his seat. "I have never discriminated against anyone," Patricia insisted, her voice rising. "I treat everyone exactly the same." Elena stood up again, leaning on her cane. "Then why did you ask Andra for proof he owned his home when you've never asked that of any white homeowner? Why did you try to evict him on false pretenses?" That notice wasn't an actual eviction, Patricia backpedaled. It was just a strongly worded warning about zoning violations. Richard, the vice president, cleared his throat. Patricia, this document clearly threatens eviction proceedings, and it appears to be written on what looks like HOA letterhead, though not our official template. The board never authorized this. Another board member, a woman with short gray hair, spoke up. I've been on this board for 4 years, and I've never seen violation data collected or presented like this. How many notices have been issued in total this year, Patricia? Patricia shuffled through her papers. I don't have that information at hand. I do, Andrew said. According to the records Mrs. Washington requested last week, there have been 134 violation notices issued in the past 6 months. 87 of them went to homes owned by people of color or immigrants, who make up less than 30% of this neighborhood. The gray-haired board member frowned. That's troubling. It's more than troubling, said a man standing in the back. He stepped forward, and Andrew recognized him as Mr. Okafor, a lawyer who lived a few streets over. It's potentially illegal housing discrimination. A tense silence fell over the room. Patricia's face had gone from red to white. I need to add something else, Andrew said, pulling out his phone. I recorded our conversation when you delivered the eviction notice, Patricia. Would you like me to play it for everyone? The part where you said I should have read the fine print before moving into a neighborhood with standards. Patricia's eyes widened. She looked at the other board members, who were now watching her with expressions ranging from disappointment to anger. I think we need to call an emergency executive session, Richard said firmly. Right now. The board members nodded in agreement. Richard turned to the packed room. Folks, we're going to need to discuss this privately as a board, but I want to assure everyone that these allegations will be taken very seriously. As the board prepared to leave for another room, Patricia grabbed her purse and headed for the door. Richard called after her, Patricia, the executive session includes you. She paused, then turned back with a stiff smile. Of course. I just needed to get something from my car. Everyone knew she had been trying to leave. The neighbors exchanged looks as the board filed out, leaving the residents to talk among themselves. You did it, Eleanor said, patting Andrew's arm. You stood up to her, and you did it perfectly. We all did it, Andrew corrected her, looking around at his neighbors. I couldn't have gathered all this evidence without everyone's help. They'd waited for nearly an hour, chatting and sharing more stories about Patricia's reign of terror. Finally, the door opened and the board members returned. Patricia was not with them. Richard stepped to the front of the room, looking tired but resolved. After reviewing the evidence presented tonight, the board has voted to remove Patricia Whitfield as HOA president, effective immediately. We've also agreed to conduct a full review of all violation notices issued in the past year and to revise our enforcement procedures to ensure fair and consistent application. Outside in the parking lot, Andrew spotted Patricia sitting in her car, staring straight ahead, knuckles white on the steering wheel. For a moment, their eyes met through the windshield. Andrew didn't smile or gloat. He simply nodded once and turned away. He had won, but this wasn't about victory. It was about justice. A cheer went up from the crowd. Richard held up his hands for quiet. Additionally, all current violation notices are suspended pending review, including the invalid eviction threat against Mr. Thomas. He looked directly at Andra. On behalf of the board, I apologize for what you've experienced. This is not what our community stands for. As the meeting broke up, neighbors came to shake Andrew's hand or pat him on the back. The relief in the room was palpable. Years of tension had finally broken. 6 months had passed since the explosive HOA meeting. Andrew stood in his backyard, flipping burgers on a new grill while neighbors chatted in small groups across his lawn. Kids chased each other through sprinklers he'd set up to combat the summer heat. Someone had brought a speaker and old-school R&B filled the air. Need any help with those? Eleanor asked, appearing at his side with a pitcher of lemonade. I think I've got it covered, Andrew smiled. Hard to believe this is the same place, isn't it? They both gazed around at the gathering. The Chens were showing Mrs. Washington photos of their son's college graduation. Mr. Diaz was deep in conversation with Richard about the community garden they'd started in an empty lot. Two teenagers were teaching a group of younger kids a complicated hand-clapping game. Night and day, Eleanor agreed. Who would have thought one bad apple could spoil things for so long? After Patricia's removal, the neighborhood had transformed. The new HOA board, which now included Anda and Mr. Chen, had completely revamped the rules. They'd simplified the regulations, focusing on basic safety and maintenance rather than controlling every detail of people's homes. The revised rules fit on a single page, not the 30-page binder Patricia had wielded like a weapon. "You seen the for sale sign?" Mr. Okafor asked, joining them with a plate of chips. "Patricia's house finally went on the market yesterday." Andrew nodded. He'd noticed the sign on his morning run. "Any idea where she's going?" "My wife heard she bought a condo in one of those gated communities across town," Mr. Okafor said. "Probably for the best. She hasn't shown her face around here since the meeting." The aftermath of Patricia's removal had been swift. The board's review found that nearly 60% of all violation notices had been improperly issued. All pending fines were cancelled, and some homeowners even received apologies for past harassment. Patricia had tried to fight back at first, threatening to sue the HOA for wrongful termination. But when Mr. Okafor calmly explained that a countersuit for housing discrimination would likely be filed, with all the evidence they'd gathered, she'd quickly backed down. "Anda, come tell Richard about your idea for the community website," called Mrs. Washington from across the yard. As Andra handed the spatula to Eleanor and walked over, he couldn't help thinking about how different things were now. His house renovations were finally complete. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances. The backyard, once a patchy mess of weeds, was now a welcoming space where neighbors gathered regularly. More importantly, Oak Ridge Estates felt like home. People waved when they drove past. They stopped to chat when they saw each other getting mail. Children played between yards without artificial boundaries. "So tell me about this website idea," Richard said as Andrew joined their group. "It's pretty simple," Andrew explained. "Just a place where we can share information, post about community events, maybe have a directory of skills people are willing to share. Mrs. Diaz is a retired nurse who can help with basic health questions. Mr. Chen does amazing photography. I'm good with computers. We've got all these resources right here in our neighborhood." Richard nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the kind of community building we need. A complete change from the old way of doing things." As the evening wore on and the sun began to set, someone suggested making a bonfire in Andrew's fire pit. Soon, people were gathered around the flames, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. "You know," Eleanor said quietly to Andrew as they watched a young father teaching his daughter how to make the perfect s'more, "I've lived here 3 decades, and this is the first time it's truly felt like a community." Andrew smiled. "That's because it is one now." Later, as guests began to head home, Andrew stood on his front porch, waving goodbye. His house stood tall behind him, windows glowing warmly in the twilight. The violation notice that had once been taped to his door was long gone, replaced by a handmade welcome sign that Eleanor had given him as a housewarming gift. As the last car pulled away, Andrew took a moment to look up at the stars appearing in the evening sky. Who would have thought that an attempt to push him out would end up making him the heart of the neighborhood instead? He turned and went inside, closing the door to his home, a home that was truly his now, in every sense of the word.